The morning my son walked through my front door with a folder full of legal papers, he didn't look at me. Not once. In 38 years of working with families in crisis, I had learned to recognize that look. It wasn't confusion. It wasn't guilt. It was a decision already made. What he didn't know was that I had made mine first. The coffee was still brewing when I heard the front door open. I knew the sound of that door, the way I knew my own breathing. 41 years of mornings had taught me every creak, every shift of the old hinges, every particular groan the wood made depending on the season. That morning, it opened the way it always did in early spring. Smooth, unhurried, like it had nothing to hide. I stayed at the kitchen table and wrapped both hands around my mug. The coffee wasn't ready yet, but the ceramic was warm, and sometimes that's enough. 2 sets of footsteps crossed the front room. One I would have recognized anywhere, a steady, measured pace I had watched, learn to walk on these very floors, back when the steps were small and uncertain. The other set was lighter, more deliberate, purposeful in a way that told you the person wearing those shoes had already decided something before they walked in. I did not turn around right away. There was a window above the kitchen sink that faced the side yard, and the morning light was coming through at that particular angle that only happens in early spring in Savannah, soft and pale, the kind that makes everything look a little gentler than it actually is. My husband had installed that window himself back in 1987 because I told him I wanted to see something living while I washed the dishes. When he finished, he stood beside me and said, "There, now you've got no excuse not to enjoy the view." 22 years since he passed, and I still thought of him every time that light came through. I turned then. My son stood in the doorway between the front room and the kitchen. He was 42 years old, a practicing attorney with a firm downtown, a man who had argued cases in front of judges and never once backed down from a difficult room. But standing there that morning, he looked younger than I had seen him look in years. Not younger in a good way. Younger the way people look when they are carrying something they haven't yet figured out how to put down. Beside him and slightly ahead of him stood his wife. She had been part of our family for 3 years, and in that time I had watched her carefully, the way I used to watch new residents on my floor at the hospital. Without letting on that, I was paying attention. She was composed in the way that certain people are composed when composure is something they have practiced. She was holding a folder against her side, her arm pressed flat against it like she didn't want me to see how thick it was. I saw anyway. "Good morning," I said. I kept my voice even. 38 years as a head nurse will do that for you. She smiled first. "Good morning. We're sorry to just stop by like this. We didn't want to make a big thing out of it." People who don't want to make a big thing out of something are usually the ones bringing the biggest thing into the room. "Sit down," I said. "Coffee's almost ready." They sat across from me. My son set his jacket on the back of his chair, the way his father used to do. His wife placed the folder on the table between us, her fingers resting lightly on top of it. The coffee maker hissed and clicked behind me. Outside, a neighbor's dog announced the morning to no one in particular. "We've been talking," my son began. He glanced at his wife, then back at me. "About the house, about the future, about making sure everything is set up properly so that you're protected." "Protected," I repeated. "There's a lot involved with a property this size," his wife said, always 1/2 step ahead of where the conversation was supposed to go. "With the market the way it is, it just makes sense to get everything formalized. We put together some paperwork. It's all standard." She opened the folder and slid several pages across the table toward me. I looked down at them. Dense with language the kind I had encountered before, in a different context. Legal writing fills a page the way fog fills a low valley. Thoroughly, in a way that makes the familiar landscape difficult to read. I did not pick the papers up. I looked at my son instead. He was staring at the table, not at the papers, not at me at a fixed point in the wood grain that seemed to require his complete attention. In nearly 4 decades of working with patients and their families, I had learned to notice the small things, the set of a person's shoulders, the direction of their gaze, the particular quality of their silence. His shoulders were drawn in, his jaw was set. He was not looking at me. I had seen that posture before, on the faces of family members who loved someone and had still, in the end, made a decision without consulting them. It was the posture of someone delivering news they had already decided was final. I reached out and placed my hand flat on top of the papers. Then I slid them back to the center of the table between us, where neither side owned them. "Leave them here," I said. I'll look them over." His wife's smile stayed exactly where it was. My son finally looked up. For just a moment, the length of a breath, no longer something moved behind his eyes. Something that might have been relief, or might have been the opposite of it. "Of course," he said. "Take your time." They didn't stay for coffee. After they left, I sat alone at that table for a long while. I looked at those papers sitting in my kitchen, in the house where I had lived for 41 years, and I thought about all the things I knew and all the things they didn't know I knew. I had seen that look before, not on my son, but on the families in my ward who had already made a decision they hadn't yet announced. After they drove away, I stayed at that table longer than I should have. Not because I was afraid, not because I didn't know what to do next. I stayed because the house was quiet in the way. It only gets quiet when something has shifted inside it, the way a room holds its breath after a difficult conversation, as if the walls themselves need a moment to settle. I had lived long enough to know that particular silence, and I had learned, a long time ago, not to rush through it. Eventually, I pushed back my chair and walked into the front room. The late morning light fell across the hardwood floors in long, uneven strips, the kind of light that shows every scratch, every scuff, every mark that 41 years of living leaves on a surface. I had stopped noticing most of those marks years ago, but that morning I noticed all of them. The shallow groove near the base of the staircase, where a certain young boy had dragged his bicycle inside one rainy afternoon, despite being told 3 separate times that the bicycle stayed on the porch. The soft depression in the floorboard by the front window, worn down by decades of someone standing in that exact spot to watch the street. Charles had always stood there, every evening without fail, watching the neighborhood settle into itself. I pressed my foot gently into that worn spot and let myself go back. We bought this house in the spring of 1983. Charles had found the listing in the newspaper, an actual newspaper, folded to the real estate section, the listing circled in ink the way he circled everything he considered worth returning to. He was 34 years old, already 2 years into his law practice, already developing the habit of deliberate attention that would define him for the rest of his life. He did not make decisions quickly. He made them carefully, and then he stood behind them without wavering. The house on Meridian Street was the 3rd property we looked at. The first 2 were newer, cleaner, easier. But when we walked through the front door of this one, the old hinges announcing us, the hardwood floors creaking a greeting, Charles stopped in the middle of the front room and was quiet for a long moment. Then he turned to me and said, "This one has something to say." I had been married to him for 2 years by then. I already knew that when Charles said a thing had something to say, he meant he intended to listen to it. We made an offer that same afternoon. The house needed work, the kind of work that takes weekends and patience and a willingness to learn things you didn't know you needed to know. Charles approached it the way he approached his legal cases, methodically, without shortcuts, with a long view toward what the finished thing would look like rather than what was easiest in the moment. He refinished the floors himself, room by room, over the course of 2 summers. He rebuilt the back porch after a storm took half of it in 1986. He planted the side garden because I mentioned once, offhandedly, that I had always wanted one. I mentioned it once. He remembered it always. That was the thing about Charles Abernathy that took me years to fully understand, not because it was hidden, but because it was so consistent that it began to seem ordinary. He paid attention. Not the surface kind of attention that people perform when they want you to feel heard, but the deep, patient kind that accumulates over time into something that looks, in the end, remarkably like love made practical. Our son was born in the winter of 1984, 14 months after we moved in. I remember the drive home from the hospital, the way the winter light sat flat and pale over the city, the way Charles kept both hands on the wheel and checked the mirrors more than usual, as if the cargo in the back seat had changed the physics of driving. When we pulled into the driveway on Meridian Street and he cut the engine, he sat for a moment without moving. Then he said quietly, "We're going to need to make sure this place holds up." He wasn't talking about the house. The years that followed were the kind that don't make for dramatic stories, but make for a life worth having. Saturday mornings with cartoons too loud in the front room, dinner table arguments about homework and curfews, and the relative importance of various things that seemed enormous at the time and microscopic now. A boy growing up in the particular, unhurried way that boys grow up when they feel safe, not always grateful for it, not always aware of it, but shaped by it nonetheless. Charles coached Little League for 3 seasons, not because he had any particular affinity for the sport, but because our son asked him to. He attended every school event, every recital, every ceremony, with the same focused presence he brought to his most important cases. He believed that showing up was a form of argument that you made your case for what mattered by where you placed your time. He placed his time, consistently and without complaint, with us. The diagnosis came on an ordinary Tuesday. Not a Tuesday that announced itself as significant, no particular weather, no forewarning. Just a Tuesday in March, 8 years ago, when Charles came home from a doctor's appointment and sat down in his chair in the front room and looked at me in a way he had never looked at me before. Pancreatic cancer, the kind that does not negotiate. The 8 months that followed were the hardest of my life, harder than anything my years in nursing had prepared me for, because nursing had taught me to care for other people's grief, not my own. Charles faced his illness the way he faced everything, without dramatics, without self-pity, with a steady, clear-eyed practicality that I found both admirable and, at times, almost unbearable to witness. He kept working for as long as he was able. He put his affairs in order with meticulous care. He spent time with our son. He spent time with me. He never once said he was afraid. I think sometimes that was his last gift, letting me believe he wasn't. He passed on a Thursday morning in November, in the bedroom at the end of the hall, with the window open the way he liked it and my hand in his. The house on Meridian Street was 41 years old and still standing, and so, somehow, was I. The house was still standing after he left. I was still standing too. What I didn't know yet was that Charles had made sure we both would be long after he was gone. Grief has a way of showing you who people really are, not in the dramatic moments, not at the service, not in the days immediately after, when everyone is present and accounted for, and the casseroles are still arriving at the door. The real revealing happens later, in the ordinary weeks and months that follow, when the world has moved on and the people who loved the person who is gone have to figure out how to carry that weight and keep walking at the same time. My son carried it well. He was 32 years old when his father passed, young enough that the loss was devastating, old enough that he knew better than to fall apart in front of me. He drove down from Atlanta the night we got the call, arrived before midnight, and spent the next 2 weeks handling the things that needed handling, the arrangements, the paperwork, the phone calls to people I didn't have the energy to make myself. He did it without being asked, and without making it seem like a burden. He did it the way his father would have done it, quietly, thoroughly, without leaving loose ends. In the months that followed, he called every Sunday evening without fail. Not a long call, most weeks. Sometimes only 10 or 15 minutes enough to check in, swap small news, confirm that the world was still turning on both ends of the line. But he called, every week, without exception, for almost 7 years. And I came to rely on those calls the way you rely on certain fix points, not because anything dramatic happened during them, but because their consistency was itself a form of reassurance. He was there. He was paying attention. Whatever else was happening in his life, he made sure I knew I was part of it. He had built a solid practice in Atlanta by then. Civil litigation, the kind of work that requires patience and precision, and the ability to hold an enormous amount of detail in your mind simultaneously. His father would have been proud of the lawyer he became, though he would have expressed it characteristically, with a single nod and a quiet good work that somehow managed to carry the weight of everything he meant. I was proud in a louder way. I told him so, regularly, and he always received it with the same slightly embarrassed half-smile that had not changed since he was 9 years old. He mentioned her for the first time on a Sunday call in early October, about 3 years ago. He was careful about it, introduced her the way he introduced most things he considered significant, which was to say, he mentioned it almost offhandedly, as if gauging the temperature of the room before committing to the full thought. He said he had met someone at a legal conference the previous month, said she was sharp, professional, knew her way around a contract, said her name, said he thought it might be something. I asked the questions a mother asks. He answered them in the measured way that told me he had already thought through most of them himself. 2 months later, he brought her to Meridian Street for the first time. She was put together in a way that suggested considerable effort made to look effortless, every detail considered, nothing left to chance. She brought a bottle of wine, asked thoughtful questions about the house, complimented the garden. She was, by any reasonable measure, a perfectly pleasant guest. And yet, Sitting across from her at the dinner table that evening, I found myself doing what 38 years in a hospital had trained me to do without thinking, watching for the gap between what a person presents and what they actually are. I didn't find anything definitive that first evening, just a small but persistent sense, the kind that doesn't announce itself loudly, but settles somewhere in the back of your awareness and stays there, that her questions were slightly more interested in what things were worth than in what they meant. I told myself I was being unfair, that I was protective of my son in the way mothers are, and that protectiveness had sharpened itself into suspicion without sufficient cause. I had seen it happen to other mothers. I was not above it. So I watched, and I waited, and I gave her the benefit of the doubt. The changes in my son were gradual enough that I might have missed them if I hadn't been paying attention. The Sunday calls didn't stop, but they shifted, moved later in the evening, grew slightly shorter, acquired a background quality that hadn't been there before. Not silence exactly, but the sense of another presence in the room, shaping the conversation by its proximity even when it said nothing. Questions I asked began to receive answers that felt slightly edited, as if they had passed through a second consideration before reaching me. He stopped talking about his cases the way he used to. He had always enjoyed walking me through the logic of a difficult argument, not for any practical reason, just because he liked thinking out loud, and I had always been a willing audience. That habit faded quietly, without announcement, sometime in the first year. Small things. The kind of things that, taken individually, mean nothing. A mother notices them anyway. I watched him at a family dinner that spring, a Sunday in April, the garden just beginning to come back after a long winter. He was telling a story about something that had happened at work, and halfway through the sentence he glanced at his wife, and something shifted in his expression, almost imperceptibly, and he changed direction mid-thought and finished with something else entirely. I noticed. I didn't say anything. I told myself every mother goes through this, that the arrival of a spouse changes the geometry of a family, and that adjustment is natural, and that what I was observing was simply that adjustment in progress. I told myself the distance I felt was ordinary, but something about the way he stopped finishing his own sentences made me wonder. There is a difference between curiosity and reconnaissance. Curiosity moves openly, it asks a question, receives an answer, and moves on satisfied. Reconnaissance circles. It approaches from different angles, uses different language, arrives at the same destination through varying routes. By the time you recognize it for what it has already mapped the territory it came to study. I recognized it 18 months ago, on an evening in late autumn when the three of us sat together after a meal I had spent the better part of an afternoon preparing. The conversation had been pleasant enough, the kind of surface-level exchange that had become, by then, the primary texture of our family gatherings. And then, in the comfortable lull that follows a good meal, my daughter-in-law set down her glass and said, almost as an afterthought, that she had been reading about property values in the historic districts of Savannah. They've gone up considerably, she said. This whole corridor, actually. I was surprised by some of the numbers. She looked around the room as she said it, not at me, not at my son, but at the room itself. The walls, the ceiling, the proportions of the space. The way a person looks at something they are trying to assign a figure to. Houses like this one, she continued, properly updated. In this location, they're selling for numbers I don't think people expect. I asked her what had prompted the research. She smiled. Just keeping an eye on things. It's good to know what you have. I agreed that it was. And I filed the moment away in the part of my mind I had spent decades training, the part that receives information without immediately processing it out loud, that holds things carefully until their significance becomes clear. I had learned that particular skill not from any book, but from the work itself. A patient's passing remark about chest tightness during an otherwise routine conversation. A family member who laughed a little too easily when a doctor explained a difficult prognosis. The human body, and the humans attached to it, are full of signals that announce themselves quietly before they announce themselves loudly. The work teaches you to catch them early. I caught this one. And I waited to see if it would repeat. It repeated. 6 weeks later, on a Saturday afternoon when my son had stepped out to run an errand, and his wife and I were briefly alone together, she brought up the subject of homeowners insurance. She had been reviewing her own policy, she explained, and it had made her realize how many people, especially older homeowners, were carrying outdated coverage that no longer reflected the actual replacement value of their property. "It's worth checking," she said, leaning slightly forward in that way she had when she wanted to seem helpful rather than interested. "The cost of materials has gone up so much. If something were to happen and the coverage didn't reflect current values, it could be a real problem." She paused. Then, "Do you mind if I ask, when did you last update your policy?" I told her I had a very capable insurance agent who handled those matters, and that everything was current and in order. She nodded, satisfied on the surface, the way a person nods when they have received a partial answer and are already calculating how to approach the rest of it from a different direction. My son returned 20 minutes later. She did not raise the subject again that afternoon, but I noticed that she had waited until he left the room to raise it at all. The third conversation happened on a Tuesday morning, 2 weeks after that. She had offered, sometime earlier, to help me organize what she called my important documents, insurance records, deed paperwork, financial statements. She had framed it as a gesture of practical care, the kind of thing a younger family member does for an older one to save them the trouble. I had thanked her and said I would let her know when I was ready. That Tuesday, she called to follow up on the offer. Had I had a chance to locate the deed? She knew these things could be filed in different places, and she just wanted to make sure everything was easy to find in case it was ever needed quickly. I told her I knew exactly where everything was. She said she was glad to hear it. Then she asked gently whether the deed was in my name alone or whether there were other names on it. I told her the paperwork from when Charles and I purchased the property was all properly documented, and that I had a family attorney who handled those matters. There was a brief pause, shorter than a breath, but present. "Of course," she said. "That's smart. It's always good to have someone looking out for you." After I set down the phone, I stood in the hallway for a moment and let the full shape of the past 3 conversations arrange itself in my mind. The property values, the insurance coverage, the deed, and whose name was on it. 3 conversations, 3 different approaches, 1 destination. I had spent 38 years in hospital wards, learning to read the difference between a patient who was asking questions because they were frightened and a patient who was asking questions because they were building a case. The frightened ones ramble. The ones building a case are methodical. They return to the same ground from different angles until they have what they came for, or until they realize they are not going to get it the easy way. She had not gotten it the easy way. I had not yet decided what to do about that, but I had decided something quietly, without announcement, the way Charles had always made his most important decisions. I was paying attention now, fully, without reservation. In 38 years of nursing, I learned that the most dangerous moment is not when someone raises their voice. It's when they smile and ask the same question 3 different ways. I waited 3 weeks before I called. Not because I was uncertain about what I had observed by the time the third conversation ended. I was quite certain. I waited because I wanted to be sure I was calling for the right reasons, not out of anxiety or the particular protectiveness that mothers sometimes mistake for clarity. I had spent enough years watching families make consequential decisions based on emotion alone to know what that looked like, and I had no interest in being that person. So I waited. I turned the observations over in my mind the way you turn a stone to see what's underneath carefully, without rushing, making sure I was seeing what was actually there rather than what I expected to find. And at the end of 3 weeks, I was satisfied that what I had seen was real, that the pattern was deliberate, and that I needed someone with a different set of tools than the ones I possessed. I called on a Wednesday morning from the small sitting room at the back of the house, the room Charles had always called the quiet room, because it faced the back garden and received no street noise and was, by general household agreement, the place where serious thinking happened. I sat in the chair by the window, dialed the number I had not dialed in over a year, and waited through 2 rings. She picked up on the third. Rebecca Lawson had been part of our lives for the better part of 25 years. She and Charles had crossed paths early in their respective careers, 2 young attorneys navigating the particular rhythms of Savannah's legal community, which operated then, as it does now, with the unhurried thoroughness of a city that has been doing things a certain way for a very long time. They had become professional acquaintances first, then genuine friends, the kind that develops between people who respect each other's minds and share a common understanding of how the world actually works beneath its polished surface. When Charles passed, Rebecca had handled the estate proceedings with the same quiet competence she brought to everything present when needed, unobtrusive when not, never making the process harder than it had to be. She had called me on the 6-month anniversary of his passing, not to discuss any legal matter, but simply to check in. I had not forgotten that. She was 63 years old now, a senior partner at a firm on Bull Street, with a reputation for thorough preparation and an absolute disinclination toward drama. Charles had always said that Rebecca Lawson was the kind of lawyer you wanted in your corner precisely because she never raised her voice. She didn't need to. "Ruth," she said, when she heard my voice, warm, unhurried, "it's good to hear from you. How are you holding up?" I told her I was holding up fine and that I was calling because something had come to my attention that I wanted her perspective on. "Tell me," she said. And she meant it the full, attentive weight of the phrase, not the social version of it. I told her everything, not in the order it had happened. At first, the mind doesn't always retrieve things chronologically when it has been carrying them for weeks, but she was patient with the telling, and she asked the right questions at the right moments to help me organize the account into something coherent. The evening with the property values, the Saturday afternoon with the insurance questions, the phone call about the deed. She listened without interrupting, which was one of the things I had always valued about her. Some people listen in order to respond. Rebecca listened in order to understand, and the difference was audible even across a telephone line. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. "How long has this been going on?" she asked. I told her the conversations I had described spanned roughly 6 weeks, but that there had been a general shift in dynamic, a growing pattern of interest in financial matters for perhaps a year before that. Another brief silence. Then, "And James, does he seem aware of any of this?" I told her I wasn't certain, that he was present for some of it and absent for others, that I had noticed, more than once, that certain conversations seemed timed for moments when he was not in the room. "All right," Rebecca said. Her voice had taken on a particular quality, the focused, slightly lowered register that I imagined she used when a case had just become more interesting than she had initially anticipated. "I'm going to pull the estate documents and the property records. Charles was meticulous about everything he filed, and I want to make sure I have a complete picture before I say anything definitive." She paused, and I heard the soft sound of a pen moving across paper. "One other thing," she said, in the same matter-of-fact tone. "For your awareness in Chatham County, guardianship petitions of the type you're describing would come before Judge Eleanor Marsh. She has been on the family court bench for 11 years. She is known, among those of us who appear before her regularly, for being exceptionally thorough." A brief pause. "I mention it only so you understand the landscape. Nothing to concern yourself with at this stage." I filed that name away the same way I filed everything carefully, without reaction, for later use. After we finished talking, I sat for a while in the quiet room and looked out at the back garden. The late-season roses Charles had planted along the far fence were past their peak by then, the last of them going soft at the edges the way late roses do, still present, still recognizable, but beginning to let go. I had been meaning to cut them back for weeks. I hadn't gotten to it. I thought about what it meant to call Rebecca. Not the practical implications, those I understood clearly enough, but the deeper meaning of the act. Calling her was an acknowledgement that what I had observed was real enough to warrant professional attention. It was the moment the thing stopped being a private concern and became something I was taking seriously enough to act on. I was glad I had waited the 3 weeks. I was equally glad that the waiting was over. I drove home through the quiet, mid-morning streets of Savannah and felt, for the first time in several weeks, that I was not entirely alone in carrying what I knew. Rebecca called me back 4 days later, on a Sunday afternoon. Her voice, when she spoke, carried the careful steadiness of someone who has found something and is choosing their words with precision. "Ruth," she said, "I need you to trust me for a few weeks." She paused for a moment. Charles was a careful man, and careful men tend to leave things behind. I didn't know what she meant. Not yet. 4 weeks after that phone call, Rebecca asked me to come in. She did not tell me what she had found over the telephone. She said only that she had reviewed the documents, that there were several things she wanted to walk me through in person, and that I should set aside a full morning. The particular care with which she said it told me that what she had found was significant. Rebecca Lawson did not ask people to set aside a full morning for routine matters. I arrived at her office on a Tuesday, just before 10 o'clock. Her firm occupied the second floor of a building near the courthouse, one of those old Savannah buildings that has settled, over its long life, into the dignified gravity of professional use. The reception area was simply furnished, with a window that looked out onto a courtyard where a pair of old magnolias stood in companionable silence. I had been to this office twice before, once when Charles was still alive, once in the weeks after he passed. Both times, the magnolias had been there. There was something steadying about that. Rebecca met me at the door herself. She shook my hand with both of hers, gestured to the chair across from her desk, and sat down across from me. She had a file open on the desk in front of her, not a thin file. "I want to start at the beginning," she said, "because I think the sequence matters." She turned the file so that I could see the first document, a property summary showing ownership history going back to original purchase. My name, Charles's name, the date in 1983. "Everything is in your name," she said. "Has been since Charles updated the title 12 years ago. Sole ownership, properly recorded. I want you to know that before we discuss anything else." I nodded. I had not known about the update. Charles had handled such matters with a thoroughness that rarely required my direct involvement, but I was not surprised. It was consistent with how he operated. 2 years before he passed," she continued, "Charles came to see me. He did not tell you he was coming." "No," I said, "he didn't. He had 2 things he wanted to put in place." She paused, organizing her words carefully. "The first was this." She placed a document on the desk between us, a single page, heavier stock than standard paper, with a notary seal in the lower right corner. A life insurance policy, issued in Charles's name, with me listed as the sole beneficiary. The coverage amount, printed in plain figures in the middle of the page, was $250,000. I looked at it for a long time without speaking. "He updated the beneficiary designation the same week he came in," Rebecca said. "No conditions, no contingencies. Solely and directly to you." I put my hand flat on the desk beside the document, the way you reach toward something without quite being ready to touch it. Charles had been gone for 8 years, and in those 8 years I had managed carefully. The way a woman of my generation manages when she understands the difference between what you need and what you want. I had not known about this policy. He had not told me, and he had not told me I was beginning to understand, for a reason. "The second thing," Rebecca said, "requires a bit more explanation." She reached into a separate section of the file and withdrew something I had not expected. A sealed envelope, its flap secured and signed across the seal in Charles's handwriting. My name was written on the front. Not a formal legal name, just Ruth in his particular hand, the letters slightly forward-leaning the way his writing always was. I recognized that handwriting the way you recognize a voice. "He left this with me the same day," Rebecca said. "With specific instructions it was not to be opened under ordinary circumstances. Only in the event that any legal action was initiated involving you, your assets, or your capacity to manage your own affairs." She set the envelope on the desk with quiet deliberateness. "Given what you described to me, and given what I have found in the past 4 weeks, I believe those conditions have been met. I have not opened it. That decision is yours." I looked at the envelope for a long time. Charles had sat in this office, this chair, perhaps 2 years before he passed, and had written my name on an envelope and sealed it and left it in the care of someone he trusted, against a day he hoped would never come. He had done it without telling me. He had done it the way he did everything that mattered, quietly, without requiring acknowledgement, simply because it needed to be done. I was not a woman who came undone easily. But sitting there, looking at my name in my husband's handwriting on an envelope that had waited 8 years to reach me, I felt something give way in a manner I did not try to prevent. Rebecca waited, with the grace of someone who knows that presence is sometimes more useful than words. After a while, I straightened. "Not yet," I said. "I want to wait until the right moment." "I'll keep it here until you're ready," she said. I set the envelope back on the desk and looked at the window and the magnolias beyond it, and thought about a man who had loved me carefully enough to think of this. "He knew something might happen one day," Rebecca said quietly, "and he made sure you wouldn't be facing it alone." I sat with that for a long time. I was still sitting with it when I got home. She called again the following week. I was in the side yard when the phone rang, pulling up the last of the winter growth along the fence line, the kind of slow, methodical work that gives your hands something to do while your mind works through other things. I had spent the 7 days since our meeting doing a great deal of that kind of work. The garden had never been so thoroughly tended. I set down my gloves and went inside to answer. "There's something else," Rebecca said, without preamble. I should have waited to tell you in person, but I think you'd rather know now. Can you talk? I sat down at the small table near the back window, not the kitchen, but the narrow reading table Charles had moved there years ago because he said the light was better for paperwork in the afternoon. I said I could talk. When I was going through the full estate file, she began, I found a second policy, separate from the one we discussed. This one is not in your name. I waited. It's in James's name, she said. Charles took it out approximately 14 months before he passed. The face value is different, considerably more modest than the first, but that's not the part I want you to understand. She paused, and I heard the particular quality of silence that precedes something carefully chosen. The policy contains a clause, Rebecca continued, a condition of continuation. The policy remains active and payable to James only as long as certain circumstances remain in place, specifically, as long as you remain in the family home and retain full, uncontested control of your assets. Her voice was measured, precise, the way it always was when she was delivering something she wanted to make sure landed correctly. If those circumstances change, if you are removed from the home, or if legal action successfully strips you of control over your own affairs, the policy lapses. Automatically. Without recourse. I sat very still. Charles built a condition into his son's inheritance, Rebecca said. One that James has never known about, one that makes his own financial future contingent on your being protected. I have spent a great deal of time, in the months since that conversation, thinking about what it means to know someone fully. I had been married to Charles Abernathy for 31 years. I had shared a home with him, raised a child with him, sat beside him through every difficulty and every ordinary Tuesday and every moment of grace that a life together accumulates over 3 decades. I had believed, with good reason, that I knew how his mind worked, the care he brought to decisions, the long view he always took, the particular way he expressed love through preparation rather than declaration. And yet, he had sat with the full weight of what might happen after he was gone, not just to me, but to the relationships and the people that mattered to him, and he had thought it through to a conclusion I would not have reached myself. He had not simply protected me. He had constructed a situation in which the person most likely to be used against me was simultaneously, and without his knowledge, the person with the most direct personal stake in my protection. He had made James my safeguard by making my security James's own, not as a punishment, not as a trap, as a belief, a quiet, unannounced belief, that his son, given the right circumstances, would choose correctly. That the young man who had driven through the night when his father passed, who had made Sunday calls for 7 years without fail, who had coached himself into someone, his father recognized that young man was still in there, still capable of the right choice, if the choice were made clear enough. Charles had not given up on his son. He had simply made sure that James's better nature had every reason to prevail. I thought about that for a long time after I set down the phone. The afternoon light had shifted while we talked, moving from the reading table to the far wall, the way it did on clear winter days when the sun dropped early. I sat in the dimming room and thought about a man who had understood, even at the end, that love is not only what you give, but what you arrange, the structures you build, the quiet provisions you make, the careful thought you extend into a future you will not be present to see. He had thought about James. Even then, even in those final months when his attention could reasonably have been entirely on himself, he had thought about what James might need in order to be the person Charles had always believed him to be. There was grief in that understanding, and there was something else alongside it, something warmer, something I had not expected to find in the middle of everything I was carrying. I picked up my gloves from where I had left them on the counter. I would finish the fence line tomorrow. The light was gone for the day, and I had a drive home to sit with what I had just learned. He didn't just think about you, Ruth, Rebecca had said before we hung up. He thought about James, too. I drove home in silence. For the first time since Charles passed, I felt something I hadn't expected to feel, something very close to peace. Peace, I have learned, is not the same thing as stillness. The peace I had felt driving home from that conversation was not the peace of someone who has set down a burden and walked away. It was the peace of someone who has finally seen the full shape of what they are carrying and understood, for the first time, that they are strong enough to carry it to its conclusion. There is a difference. The first kind makes you passive. The second kind makes you clear. And clarity, in my experience, leads to action. I gave myself 1 week, 1 week to sit with everything Rebecca had told me, to let it settle into the proper order in my mind, to make sure that what I was about to do was deliberate rather than reactive. On the 8th day, I made a phone call not to Rebecca this time, but to a colleague I had worked alongside for 11 years at the hospital before my retirement, a neurologist, now in private practice at a medical center on the north side of the city. I told her I wanted a full cognitive evaluation, comprehensive, documented, conducted under standard clinical protocol. There was a brief pause. "Ruth," she said carefully, "is something going on?" I told her something might be, and that I would rather have the documentation before I needed it than discover I needed it when it was too late. She understood. She had been in medicine long enough to understand. The evaluation took the better part of a morning. I had administered versions of these assessments myself, over the years not as a neurologist, but in the way that experienced nurses develop a working familiarity with the tools used around them. I knew what was being measured: memory recall, executive function, processing speed, orientation, language fluency. I knew the difference between a score that indicated normal aging and one that indicated something more significant. When the results came back, they were unambiguous: full cognitive function across every measured domain. The evaluating physician, a careful man who chose his words the way careful people always do, with precision rather than volume, noted in his written summary that the results were, in his assessment, entirely consistent with a woman considerably younger than my stated age. I thanked him, took my copy of the report, and scheduled the second evaluation. The second test was conducted 8 weeks later at a different facility, a teaching hospital, affiliated with a university medical program south of the city. Different physician, different testing instruments, same outcome. The summary used different language, but reached an identical conclusion. I scheduled the third evaluation the same afternoon. By the time I walked out of the third facility, a private neurology practice on the eastern edge of the city, 6 months after I had begun, I had 3 independent reports from 3 unaffiliated institutions, signed by 3 separate physicians, each arriving at the same finding through different methodologies. In a court of law, or in any proceeding where someone might attempt to question my capacity to manage my own affairs, those 3 documents would represent a very particular kind of obstacle, the kind that cannot be argued around, only through. I had not told Rebecca I was doing this. I had not told anyone, except Dorothy. Dorothy Webb had lived in the house directly across the street for 30 years, a compact, sharp-eyed woman of 72 who had spent her career teaching 4th grade and had, in the process, developed an almost supernatural ability to detect when something was being withheld. She had brought a casserole the week Charles passed and had never quite stopped checking in, which suited me perfectly because her version of checking in was never intrusive. She knocked, she sat, she listened, and she said exactly as much as the situation required, and not a word more. We had fallen into the habit, over the years, of Wednesday afternoon tea. Not every Wednesday life interrupted often enough, but often enough that it had become a fixture, the kind of regular appointment that does not require scheduling because both parties simply know when it is. On a Wednesday in late winter, about 7 months into the process of what I had come to think of as my quiet preparation, I told her everything. Not because I needed advice. I had Rebecca for that. I told Dorothy because I had been carrying the weight of it alone for long enough that it had begun to feel like a second full-time occupation, and there is a particular kind of exhaustion that comes not from the weight itself, but from the effort of concealing it from the people who know you well enough to notice. Dorothy listened without interrupting a skill she had honed over 30 years of managing classrooms full of children who needed to feel heard before they could hear anything in return. She held her cup in both hands and looked at me steadily while I talked, and when I finished, she was quiet for a moment in the way she always was before she said something she had actually thought about. Then she set her cup down on the table between us and looked at me with the particular directness that had always been her most reliable quality. "Charles chose you for a reason, Ruth," she said. "Trust that he chose right." I looked at her for a moment. Outside, the street was quiet, the particular mid-afternoon quiet of a Wednesday in late winter, when most of the world is occupied elsewhere, and the neighborhood belongs, briefly, to whoever is paying attention. I picked up my cup. "I intend to," I said. Dorothy nodded once, satisfied, and reached for the plate of shortbread between us. The subject, as far as she was concerned, was settled. It was the most useful conversation I had in the entirety of those months. Dorothy said, "Charles chose you for a reason, Ruth. Trust that he chose right." I held on to those words for every difficult day that followed. There is a moment in every long preparation when the thing you have been preparing for finally arrives. You would think, after all the planning, all the quiet months of gathering and waiting and holding yourself steady, that the arrival would feel like a relief, that the uncertainty, the not knowing exactly when or how would be the hardest part, and that its resolution would bring with it some measure of release. It doesn't work that way. The morning I learned that the petition had been filed, I was sitting at the small writing desk near the front window, the one Charles had refinished the summer before James started school, the one with the shallow drawer that stuck slightly in humid weather. I had been going through a stack of correspondence that had accumulated over the previous few weeks, the ordinary business of a household that continues its routines regardless of what is happening beneath the surface. Rebecca's message arrived just after 9 o'clock. Short, factual, the way she communicated when the facts were large enough to carry their own weight without elaboration. A petition for guardianship had been filed in Chatham County Family Court 2 days prior. The petitioner was listed as my son's wife, with my son named as a co-petitioner. A supporting psychological evaluation, prepared by a private practitioner, had been submitted alongside the petition as documentation of the claimed basis for the filing. I set down the envelope I had been holding and read the message a second time. Then a third. The document Rebecca forwarded later that morning was 17 pages long. I did not read it immediately. I set it on the desk and went to make a fresh pot of something warm, not coffee, but the chamomile tea I kept for evenings when sleep came reluctantly, because something about that particular morning felt like it required the slower, quieter version of comfort. I stood at the counter while the water heated and looked out at the street and thought about the particular mechanics of what had just happened. Priscilla had moved. After 18 months of questions and approaches and carefully worded suggestions, she had stopped circling and committed to a direction. The psychological evaluation she had submitted prepared, according to the cover notation, by a practitioner whose name I did not recognize from any professional context I had encountered in 38 years of medical work, claimed to document cognitive decline significant enough to warrant removal of my legal autonomy. I thought about the 3 reports in the folder Rebecca was holding. I thought about the 3 physicians, the 3 facilities, the 6 months of careful, undramatic preparation. Then I went back to the desk and read all 17 pages. My son's signature was on page 14, not Priscilla's, alone his. In the space designated for co-petitioner, in the careful, slightly leftward-leaning script I had watched develop from the uncertain printing of a 7-year-old learning to write his own name, was the signature of my son. I looked at it for a long time. I want to be precise about what I felt in that moment, because it would be easy and inaccurate to describe it simply as hurt. It was more complicated than that. There was hurt in it, certainly. There was the particular grief of a parent who watches a child make a choice they cannot unmake and understands, in the same moment, that the child does not fully understand what they have done. But there was also something else, something that sat alongside the hurt without diminishing it. A recognition that this signature, on this document, on this particular morning, meant that the envelope Rebecca had been holding for 8 years was about to be opened. James had signed a document. He did not know that in doing so, he had set in motion something his father had put in place long before either of them had anticipated this day. I closed the document and sat back in my chair and breathed carefully, the way I had learned to breathe in difficult moments, in through the nose, slow count of 4, out through the mouth, a technique I had taught to patients in distress for decades. It worked as well for the person teaching it as for the ones learning. Outside, the morning continued as mornings do, indifferent to interior upheaval, proceeding at its own pace. A delivery truck moved slowly down the block. 2 houses over, someone's wind chime registered a passing breeze. The ordinary world, doing what it always does. I was still sitting at that desk when my phone rang that evening. Rebecca's voice, when she spoke, had the particular quality it carried when she had already worked through the emotional weight of something and arrived at the functional side of it, steady, focused, pointing forward rather than back. "I received the court notification this afternoon," she said. "The filing triggers the condition Charles specified." A brief pause. "Everything we've been preparing, the reports, the documents, the envelope, it's all in order." Another pause, shorter than the first. "I want you to know that before I say anything else." I told her I understood. Outside the front window, the last of the evening light was leaving the street, the particular slow departure of late winter dusk, when the sky holds on to the pale remnant of the day longer than seems reasonable before finally releasing it. "Ruth," she said. Her voice was steady. "It's time." Those two words were the only ones I needed. I had slept better than I expected. Dorothy's guest room faced east, and the early light came through the curtains at an angle that made the ceiling glow a pale, unhurried warmth before the rest of the world had fully committed to the day. I lay still for a few minutes after waking, listening to the sounds of a house that was not mine, the particular settling of different floorboards, the faint rhythm of Dorothy's movements in the kitchen below, the distant call of a mockingbird somewhere in the yard outside. There is something clarifying about waking in an unfamiliar space. It reminds you that the world is larger than the trouble you are carrying. I dressed carefully. The suit had hung in Dorothy's closet since the evening. I arrived a deep navy wool that I had owned for 12 years and worn to every occasion that had required me to present myself as someone not to be underestimated. Charles had called it my serious suit, and he had meant it as the highest possible compliment. I buttoned it slowly, smoothed the lapels, and looked at myself in the narrow mirror on the back of the closet door for a long moment. 70 years old, 38 years in medicine, a life built carefully and kept with intention. I was ready. My phone showed a message from Rebecca, sent at 6:47 that morning. "Everything is in order. I will see you there." 4 words beyond the necessary information. 4 words that carried, in their plainness, everything that did not need to be said. Downstairs, Dorothy was standing at the stove when I came into the kitchen. She did not make a production of the morning, did not offer speeches or reassurances, or the kind of well-meaning commentary that people sometimes layer over difficult moments out of an inability to tolerate silence. She handed me a cup of something hot, looked at me once with the direct, unhurried appraisal of someone who has known you long enough to read you accurately, and said simply, "You look like yourself." Coming from Dorothy, that was exactly the right thing to say. I drank the tea standing at her counter, watching the street through her front window. The neighborhood was just beginning its morning, a man walking a dog at the measured pace of long habit, a car easing out of a driveway 3 houses down, the ordinary choreography of an ordinary Wednesday that had no idea what kind of day it was. I set down the cup, picked up my bag, and walked to the door. "I'll hear from you this afternoon," Dorothy said. It was not a question. "You will," I said. The drive to the courthouse took 14 minutes. I had driven it once before, 2 days earlier, just to know the route to take the uncertainty of navigation off the list of things requiring attention on the morning itself. Charles had taught me that. "Remove every preventable variable," he used to say. "Save your attention for the things you cannot control." I parked in the structure 2 blocks east of the building and walked the rest. The morning air was cool and carried the particular clarity that comes after several days of rain, everything sharp-edged and fully present, the kind of morning that does not allow for vagueness. I was glad of it. I wanted clarity. The Chatham County Courthouse was a building that took itself seriously. High ceilings, wide corridors, the accumulated gravity of decades of consequential proceedings conducted within its walls. I had been inside it only once before, years ago, for a matter that had nothing to do with anything that followed. I remembered the way sound moved differently in a building like that, absorbed, rather than reflected, as if the walls had learned discretion from long exposure to difficult human business. Rebecca was waiting near the entrance to the assigned hearing room. She had a leather portfolio under one arm and the composed, forward-focused expression of someone fully prepared and entirely uninterested in the drama of the situation. She shook my hand, looked at me the way she always did, taking stock without making a performance of it, and said, "We're in good shape. Let's go in." The hearing room was smaller than I had imagined. Not a full courtroom, a family court chamber, wood-paneled, fluorescent lit, with a raised bench at the front and 2 counsel tables arranged before it. Functional rather than formal, the kind of room designed for the resolution of private matters rather than public spectacle. A narrow window along one wall admitted a strip of gray morning light that fell across the floor and stopped just short of the center of the room, as if it knew its place. Priscilla and her attorney were already seated at the table to the left when we entered. She was composed in the way I had come to recognize over 3 years of careful observation, a composure that was less a state of being than a performance of one, maintained with the particular effort of someone who has rehearsed it thoroughly. She had positioned herself at the table with the settled confidence of a person who believes the outcome of a proceeding has already been determined and who is present only to witness the formality of its conclusion. She did not look at me when I entered. My son was seated beside her. He was looking at the table in front of him with the same fixed, inward attention I had noticed. On the morning he and Priscilla had come to the house with their papers, the attention of someone who has committed to a position and is working very hard not to examine it too closely. His jacket was pressed. His hands were flat on the table. He did not look up when I took my seat. I looked at him for a moment, the angle of his jaw, the set of his shoulders, the particular way he held himself when he was carrying something he hadn't resolved, and I thought of the boy who had learned to walk on those floors, and the man his father had believed. He still was underneath everything that had accumulated on top of that. Then I turned to face the bench and waited. The judge entered without ceremony. The Honorable Eleanor Marsh had been on the family court bench for 11 years, as Rebecca had noted. She was a compact, deliberate woman who moved through the room the way people move when they are entirely comfortable with the authority they carry, without performance, without announcement, simply present and fully occupying the space. She settled into her chair behind the bench, opened the folder before her, and spent a moment reviewing its contents in silence. The room waited. When she looked up, she did not look at Priscilla's attorney. She did not look at Rebecca. She looked at the folder for one moment longer, turned a page, and then set her pen down with the particular deliberateness of someone who has decided something. "Counsel," she said, her voice carrying the unhurried authority of someone accustomed to being heard the first time. "Before we begin, I'd like to address something I received last week." Priscilla's attorney shifted in his seat. Priscilla did not move at all. The judge did not explain immediately what she had received. She let the question sit in the room for a moment, the practiced patience of someone who understands that silence, deployed correctly, is its own form of authority. Then she folded her hands on the bench and looked at Rebecca with the attentive neutrality of a person who has heard many versions of many stories and has learned to wait for the one that holds together under examination. "Counsel for the respondent," she said, "I'd like you to walk me through the documentation you submitted to this court last week, in full, before we hear anything else." Rebecca stood. I had watched her work before, not in a courtroom, but in the focused, unhurried way she approached every matter she considered worth her complete attention. She carried the same quality into that room. No theatrics, no elevated register, no attempt to perform the significance of what she was about to present. She simply opened her portfolio, removed the first document, and placed it on the table with the same quiet deliberateness she brought to everything. "Your Honor," she said, "I'd like to begin with the letter you received so that the court understands the context for everything that follows." The letter, as Rebecca explained it, had been prepared in accordance with instructions left by my late husband, a licensed attorney of 30 years standing in the state of Georgia, at the time he established certain protective provisions for my benefit. The letter was addressed directly to whichever presiding judge might find themselves overseeing any legal proceeding involving my person or my assets. It outlined, in plain and specific language, the existence of the provisions, their legal basis, and the documentation that would be presented to support them. Priscilla's attorney rose. "Your Honor, the relevance of correspondence from a deceased individual to these proceedings will become apparent shortly," the judge said, without looking up from the copy Rebecca had provided her. "Sit down, counsel." He sat. The judge read for a moment longer, then set the letter aside and looked at Rebecca. "Continue." Rebecca turned to the second item. "The petitioners have submitted a psychological evaluation," Rebecca said, claiming that my client demonstrates cognitive decline sufficient to warrant removal of her legal autonomy. I'd like to address that claim directly. She placed 3 documents on the table side by side, in a row, with the measured precision of someone laying out an argument rather than simply presenting paperwork. 3 independent cognitive assessments, 3 separate medical institutions, 3 physicians with no professional affiliation to one another and no prior relationship to either party in the proceeding. Each evaluation conducted according to standard clinical protocol over a period of 6 months at 2-month intervals, each arriving, through its own methodology and measurement instruments, at the same conclusion. Rebecca read the summary finding from the first report aloud, then the second, then the third. The language was clinical, precise, and unambiguous. Full cognitive function across every measured domain. Results consistent with a woman in excellent neurological health. No indicators of decline. No basis, in any of the 3 assessments, for the claim that had been submitted to this court. The room was very quiet. Priscilla's attorney gathered himself. Your Honor, the petitioner's evaluation was conducted by a licensed practitioner who conducted a single assessment, Rebecca said, without raising her voice, using a single methodology, at a single point in time, with no independent verification. She paused, just long enough. The respondent has 3 independent assessments, conducted across 6 months by 3 separate institutions. If the court wishes to weigh 1 against 3, we are prepared to support that comparison with the full clinical records from each facility. The judge looked at Priscilla's attorney. Do you have a response to the discrepancy in documentation? A pause that was slightly too long to be comfortable. We would request an opportunity to review. You've had the standard discovery period, the judge said. She made a note. We'll proceed. I had been watching my son. Not constantly I had needed to pay attention to what Rebecca was presenting, but in the intervals between documents, in the spaces between exchanges, I had been tracking him with the peripheral awareness of someone who has spent a lifetime reading people in rooms where the stakes were high. He had been still since we entered. The particular stillness of someone holding themselves in place by effort rather than ease, the way a person stands rigid when they are afraid that movement will reveal something they are working to conceal. His eyes had been fixed forward on the bench, on the middle distance, on anything that was not the table in front of him where Rebecca's documents were accumulating into something that could not be dismissed or minimized or explained away by a different framing. After the 3rd assessment summary was read aloud, his attorney, the one seated beside Priscilla, leaned toward her and said something in a low voice that I could not hear. Priscilla's response was a single, quiet word and a slight movement of her head that I recognized. The gesture of someone doubling down, someone who has decided that the current position must be held regardless of the evidence accumulating against it. My son watched this exchange, and then, for the first time since we had entered that room, for the first time, I realized, since the morning he had stood in my kitchen and waited for me to sign papers, I had no intention of signing. He turned his head and looked directly at me. It lasted only a moment, the length of a breath, perhaps 2. But I had spent 38 years learning to read what a person's expression carries when they believe no one important is watching. And in that brief, unguarded moment, I saw not guilt, not yet, not understanding, not fully, but something prior to both of those things, something that has to arrive before either of them can follow. For the first time since we had walked into that room, James looked at me, and I saw something in his eyes I hadn't seen in 3 years, doubt. Not about me, about her. Rebecca did not rush. She gave the room a moment to settle after the exchange about the assessments. Let the weight of what had just been established find its level, the way water finds its level, before introducing the next element. I had noticed her doing this throughout, managing the pace of the proceeding, the way a skilled clinician manages a difficult conversation, giving each piece of information enough space to land fully before moving to what came next. She reached into her portfolio and withdrew a small device. Compact, unremarkable, the kind of digital recorder that sits on a desk so quietly you forget it is there. She set it on the table in front of her with the same unhurried deliberateness she had brought to every document that morning. Your Honor, she said, with the court's permission, I'd like to present an audio record. It was made by my client's late husband, approximately 22 months before his passing, at his own initiative, in the presence of a witness whose notarized affidavit confirming the recording's authenticity and date of creation is included in the supplemental file already submitted to this court. The judge looked at Priscilla's attorney. Objection? A pause. He glanced at Priscilla. She gave him nothing, not a word, not a gesture, not the smallest acknowledgement that she was aware of his glance. He turned back to the bench. We would request an opportunity to verify. The verification documentation has been in the submitted file for 11 days, Rebecca said quietly. Counsel has had access to it since submission. The judge made a note. The recording will be heard. Proceed. Rebecca pressed a single button. The room changed. Not dramatically, the walls did not shift. The light did not alter. The proceedings did not pause in any formal sense. But something moved through that space the moment the recording began. something that had nothing to do with legal process and everything to do with the particular, irreducible impact of a human voice. Charles's voice. It had been 8 years. 8 years since I had heard it outside of memory, outside of the imperfect reconstructions the mind makes when it is trying to hold on to something it cannot afford to lose. And here it was present in the room, occupying actual air, arriving through a small device on a table in a courthouse chamber as steadily and clearly as if he had simply walked in and sat down. He sounded like himself. That was the first thing I registered. Before content, before meaning, before anything analytical, he simply sounded exactly like himself. The particular cadence of his speech, the measured pace, the slight deliberateness he brought to words he considered important, the voice of a man who thought before he spoke and meant what he said when he said it. He did not sound angry. He did not sound afraid. He sounded the way he had always sounded when he was explaining something he wanted to make certain was understood correctly, careful, clear, without ornamentation. He spoke for 11 minutes. In those 11 minutes, he described in specific, dated, chronological order a series of observations he had made over the 14 months preceding the recording. He described questions that had been asked about property values and insurance coverage and the names on legal documents. He described occasions on which financial records had been accessed without his knowledge, and the dates on which he had discovered the access. He described 3 separate conversations in which information about the estate had been sought through indirect means, and he described the pattern he had identified across those conversations, the same destination approached from different angles, the same questions asked in different language. He named no one. He did not need to. He spoke in the precise, evidentiary language of a lawyer, because that was what he was, a man who understood that what matters in a legal proceeding is not what you believe, but what you can demonstrate. Every observation he recorded was specific, dated, and verifiable. Every inference he drew was labeled clearly as inference rather than fact. It was, I understood as I listened, a document prepared not in emotion but in foresight by a man who hoped it would never be needed and made certain it would be sufficient if it was. The recording ended with a single sentence, spoken in the same measured tone as everything that had preceded it. I make this record not out of bitterness, but out of love and out of the belief that the truth, documented carefully, is the most durable protection I can leave behind. Then silence. The silence held for several seconds after the recording ended. Priscilla was very still. Her attorney had stopped writing. The judge was looking at the device on the table with the expression of someone processing the full implication of what they have just heard. I was looking at my son. He had been still for the first several minutes of the recording, the rigid, controlled stillness I had observed since we entered the room, the stillness of a man holding himself together by force of will. But somewhere in the middle of those 11 minutes, the stillness had changed quality. It had stopped being controlled and started being something else, the frozen quality of a person who has heard something that has reached past every defense they constructed and arrived somewhere unprotected. His shoulders had dropped. His hands, which had been flat on the table, were no longer flat. When the recording ended, he did not move for a moment. Then, slowly, without drama, without the kind of visible collapse that announces itself, he brought his hands up and covered his face. The sound that followed was quiet. Private in the way that certain sounds are private even when they occur in public spaces, the kind of sound that asks, without words, not to be witnessed directly. I looked away, not because I could not bear it, but because some moments belong entirely to the person inside them, and the most respectful thing you can offer is the privacy of your averted gaze. James put his face in his hands, and the sound he made was not something I will ever describe. It was the sound of a man hearing his father's voice tell him everything he had refused to see. Rebecca gave the room exactly 30 seconds. I counted them not deliberately, but in the way you count things when your mind is doing several things at once, and one of them is keeping track of time, because time, in that moment, felt like the only variable still moving at a predictable rate. The recording had ended. The silence had settled. James had not lifted his face from his hands. At 30 seconds, Rebecca reached into her portfolio again. "There is one more item," she said. Her voice carried no particular emphasis on the word one, no theatrical weight, no deliberate pause to signal significance. She simply said it and placed the next document on the table, and the restraint of that delivery made it more effective than any amount of emphasis could have. "Your Honor, The court has already been presented with the primary insurance policy held in the respondent's name. What I'm presenting now is a separate instrument, a second policy, taken out by the same individual, approximately 14 months before the first was recorded with this court's estate filing. She slid a copy across to the judge and set another on the table facing the room. This policy is not held in the respondent's name, Rebecca continued. It is held in the name of the co-petitioner. The shift in the room was not loud. It was the kind of shift that moves through people rather than around them, a change in atmospheric pressure rather than temperature, something felt in the chest before it is processed by the mind. Priscilla's attorney went very still. Priscilla herself did not move, but something altered in the quality of her stillness. It became the stillness of someone recalculating, rather than the stillness of someone in control. James slowly raised his head. The policy contains a continuation clause, Rebecca said, her voice remaining level, proceeding through the explanation with the same unhurried precision she had maintained throughout the morning. The co-petitioner, my client's son, is named as the sole beneficiary. The policy is active and remains payable under one specific condition, that the respondent continues to reside in the family home and retains full, uncontested legal control of her own affairs. She paused. Not for effect for breath, the distinction was audible. In the event that the respondent is removed from the family home or that her legal autonomy is successfully challenged in any court proceeding, the policy lapses immediately and permanently. No grace period. No appeal mechanism. The termination is automatic upon the satisfaction of either condition. James was looking at the document now. He had straightened in his chair not fully, not with the recovered composure of someone who has processed what they've heard, but with the particular alertness of a mind that has been trained to engage with legal language and cannot stop itself from doing so, even when the legal language is dismantling the ground beneath it. I watched him read. I watched the moment the full meaning of the clause arrived, not the legal meaning, which a lawyer of his experience would have grasped in seconds, but the other meaning, the meaning underneath the legal meaning. His father had not simply protected me. His father had constructed a situation in which my son's own financial future was inseparable from my safety. Not as punishment, Charles had never operated from punishment. As architecture, as the quiet, unannounced expression of a belief that his son, presented with the full weight of consequence, would choose correctly. That the man who had driven through the night and kept the Sunday calls and stood at gravesides without being asked that man was still the primary version of his son, regardless of what had accumulated on top of him in the years since. Charles had bet on James, even at the end, even knowing what he had observed and recorded and filed away against a day he hoped would never come. James sat with the document in front of him and understood all of this in the space of perhaps 45 seconds. I know because I was watching, and because understanding, when it arrives in full, has a particular quality in a person's face that cannot be mistaken for anything else. It was Priscilla who moved first. Not dramatically, she did not raise her voice, did not make the kind of visible scene that announces itself. She leaned toward her attorney and spoke in a low, rapid tone, and whatever she said carried sufficient urgency that he immediately raised his hand toward the bench. Your Honor, we'd request a brief recess, too. The petitioner has had considerable time to prepare for this proceeding, the judge said. She was looking at the document Rebecca had provided, turning it to the continuation clause with the focused attention of someone reading something for the second time to make certain they have read it correctly the first time. We will continue. Priscilla sat back. Her attorney lowered his hand, and then she stood up. It was not a planned movement, I could tell that immediately, because planned movements in legal proceedings have a particular quality of coordination that this one lacked entirely. She simply stood, the way a person stands when the body makes a decision that the mind is still catching up to. Her attorney put a hand on her arm. She shook it off. The judge looked up from the document. The room was absolutely still, the kind of stillness that happens when everyone present understands simultaneously that something has broken through the formal surface of the proceeding and is now operating by different rules. Priscilla stood at the table, and for the first time since I had known her, she had no composure left to perform. What remained was not anger exactly, and not fear exactly, but something that lived in the narrow space between the two. The expression of a person who has just understood that every exit they planned has been closed and has not yet accepted that understanding fully enough to stop looking for one. Priscilla stood up. Her lawyer put a hand on her arm. She shook it off. but she had nowhere to go. The door was right there, and so was everything she had done to get to it. Priscilla did not sit back down. She stood at the table for a moment that stretched longer than it should have, long enough for the room to understand that she was not composing herself but calculating, running through options with the focused speed of someone who has spent years preparing for contingencies and has just encountered the one she did not prepare for. Her attorney said something to her in a low voice. She did not respond to him. She was looking at the document Rebecca had placed on the table, the second policy, the continuation clause, the architecture her father-in-law had built around her without her knowledge. Then she picked up her bag, straightened her jacket with a single, precise movement, and walked toward the door. She did not look at James. She did not look at me. The door opened and closed, and she was gone. The sound of it, not a slam, not a dramatic exit, just the ordinary mechanical sound of a door performing its function, was somehow more final than any louder departure could have been. She had simply left. As if, once the calculation was complete and the outcome was clear, there was nothing left in that room worth staying for. I watched the door for a moment after it closed. Then I looked at my son. James was still seated. He was looking at the space where his wife had been, not at the door, not at the table, but at the air beside the empty chair. The way a person looks at the place something was after it is no longer there. His hands were folded on the table in front of him. His attorney had leaned close and was speaking quietly, but James was not attending to what was being said. He was somewhere else entirely. I recognized that look. I had seen it on patients in the hours after a difficult diagnosis, not the initial shock, which is loud and visible and demands response, but the quieter moment that comes afterward, when the shock has passed and what remains is the task of adjusting every assumption you have been operating under to account for what you now know. It is not a quick process. It cannot be rushed. It simply has to be moved through. James was moving through it in real time, in a courthouse chamber, with a judge waiting and a proceeding still technically in session. He moved through it in approximately 90 seconds. Then he unfolded his hands, placed them flat on the table, and stood up. He did not look at his attorney. He looked at the judge. "Your Honor," he said. His voice was steady in the careful way that voices are steady when steadiness is being maintained by effort rather than ease, controlled, deliberate. Each word placed with the attention of someone who understands that what they say next will be a matter of record. "I would like to withdraw my name from this petition." The judge looked at him with the attentive neutrality she had maintained throughout the proceedings. "You understand that withdrawal at this stage." "I understand the implications," he said. "I am withdrawing." A brief pause. The judge made a note. "The record will reflect the co-petitioner's withdrawal." She looked at Priscilla's now unrepresented position, then at Rebecca. "In light of the withdrawal, and in light of the documentation presented to this court this morning, the petition is dismissed. The respondent retains full legal autonomy over her person and her assets. This court finds no basis for any guardianship proceeding against the respondent, and any future petition on the same grounds will require substantially new evidence to be considered." She closed the folder in front of her with a quiet, final sound. "We're adjourned." She stood and left the bench without ceremony, the same unhurried, authoritative movement with which she had entered, bookending the morning with the same quality of calm. Rebecca began gathering her documents. The room had the particular quality of aftermath, the specific texture of a space in which something significant has concluded and the people remaining are finding their way back to ordinary function. The court reporter was closing her equipment. James's attorney was collecting his materials with the practiced efficiency of a professional who has learned to exit difficult rooms cleanly. Rebecca caught my eye across the table and gave me a single nod. Not celebratory, not theatrical, simply the nod of one person confirming to another that the thing they set out to accomplish has been accomplished. I nodded back. Then I became aware that my son was standing beside me. I had not heard him approach, or perhaps I had, and some part of me had simply held still and waited. The way you hold still when something important is about to happen and you do not want to disturb it by moving. He was standing close enough that I could have reached out and touched his arm without extending my reach. He was not looking at the room or the table or the door through which his wife had departed. He was looking at me. I turned to face him fully. He opened his mouth. Whatever he had intended to say, whatever words he had prepared in those 90 seconds of internal recalibration, or in the 11 minutes of listening to his father's voice, or in the long weeks and months before this morning that he would need considerable time to account for they did not arrive. He got as far as a single word before his voice gave way beneath the weight of everything the word was carrying, and then he stopped. He stood there with the unfinished sentence between us, and his eyes bright in the way that eyes get bright when a person is holding something back by the thinnest possible margin, and his hands at his sides in the open, undefended way of someone who has set down something heavy and has not yet decided what to do with their hands now that they are empty. I looked at my son, 42 years old, a grown man, a lawyer, a person who had made choices I would need to find a way to understand and he would need to find a way to live with, and I saw, beneath all of that, the boy who had learned to walk on those floors, who had called every Sunday for 7 years, who had driven through the night without being asked. I stepped forward and put my arms around him. He said, "Mom," and couldn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. 38 years of nursing had taught me that sometimes the most important things are the ones left unspoken. We did not talk much on the drive back. James drove. I sat in the passenger seat and watched the city move past the window, the particular afternoon version of Savannah, unhurried and warm, going about its Wednesday with the complete indifference of a place that has been here long enough to have seen everything and finds very little of it surprising. Storefronts, a school letting out, 2 elderly men on a bench outside a barber shop, engaged in the kind of conversation that has no particular destination and no particular urgency, and is valuable precisely because of that. James kept both hands on the wheel. He had done this since he was a new driver, the habit of attentiveness that his father had instilled in him on the very first day he sat behind a wheel, in this same city, on streets that had not changed nearly as much as the people driving them. I had not thought about that in years. I thought about it now. We stopped at a light 3 blocks from the house. A woman crossed in front of us with a stroller, unhurried, trusting the signal. James watched her pass. I watched him. There was something different about his face. Not resolved resolution takes longer than an afternoon, and I knew that what had happened in that room would require considerable time to fully account for. But different in the way that a face looks different after a long fever breaks. Not well yet, not entirely, but past the worst of it, facing in a direction that had not been available to it before. The light changed. He drove. The house was exactly as I had left it. Of course, it was houses do not rearrange themselves in your absence. Do not register the significance of what has happened to their inhabitants by shifting their contents or adjusting their particular quality of light. The front walkway was the same 22 steps it had always been. The rosebush at the corner of the porch had put out 3 new blooms in the 4 days I had been at Dorothy's, indifferent to the proceedings it had no knowledge of. The door, when James unlocked it and held it open, swung the way it always swung in late winter smooth, without resistance. I stepped inside and stood for a moment in the front room. The afternoon light came through the west-facing windows at the low angle of a February afternoon long and slanted, casting everything in the particular amber warmth that makes ordinary rooms look like paintings. The furniture was in its place. The bookshelves held their familiar contents. The chair by the window, where I had sat more evenings than I could count, was exactly where it had always been. Everything was where I had left it. Nothing had been taken. I stood there and let that register. The way you let something register when you have been preparing for loss, and the loss has not, in the end, arrived. James closed the door behind us and stood in the hallway for a moment. He looked around the room with the expression of someone seeing a familiar place from an unfamiliar angle, as if the morning's events had shifted something in his internal reference points and the recalibration was still in progress. "I'll put something on," he said. He went into the kitchen. I heard the familiar sequence of sounds, the cabinet where the cups were kept, the particular slide and resistance of that drawer, the fill of water, the measured steps of someone who knows a space well enough to navigate it without looking. I had heard those sounds 10,000 times. I had not heard them from him in longer than I wanted to calculate. I settled into the chair by the front window and listened. There was a pause, the particular pause of someone locating something they haven't looked for in a while. Then the sound of the small canister on the second shelf being opened, the one Charles had labeled in his careful handwriting years ago and that I had continued to refill without changing the label, because some things you continue without being entirely sure why and only understand the reason later. James had found the coffee. I heard 2 measured spoonfuls. No more Charles had been precise about this. in the way he was precise about things that other people considered too small to be worth precision. 2 spoons, leveled. No sugar, because sugar, he had said, obscured the actual flavor rather than enhancing it, and there was no point in obscuring things when the real thing was available. The water going in at the right temperature, not boiling, another of his quiet specifications that had become household fact so gradually that neither of us had ever registered the transition from instruction to habit. Then the sound I had not realized I had been waiting for. 3 slow, deliberate stirs. Not 2, not 4. 3, the specific number Charles had arrived at through some private calculation, and passed on with the casual certainty of someone transmitting established truth. James had absorbed this fact somewhere in childhood, the way children absorb 1,000 small facts from the people around them, most of which they carry forward without knowing they are carrying them. He carried this one forward. I looked out the window at the street, the same late afternoon light, the same neighborhood conducting its ordinary Thursday business on the far side of the glass. A cardinal had settled on the branch of the dogwood tree that grew at the edge of the property, and it sat there for a moment regarding the street with the bright, particular attention that birds bring to everything, and then it was gone. James came in from the kitchen carrying 2 cups. He set one on the side table beside my chair, the way his father had always done, handle toward me, positioned so I could reach it without leaning. He took the other to the sofa across from me and sat down without looking for a place to put himself, with the ease of someone settling back into a space that had always fit him, even when he had been away from it. Visalt. The room held us in its particular afternoon quiet, the slow tick of the mantel clock, the distant sound of a neighbor's lawnmower 3 houses down, the low warmth of the light moving by degrees across the floor as the sun continued its descent. Neither of us spoke. There was nothing, in that moment, that required saying. The morning had said most of it. The rest would keep until we were both steadier. I reached for my cup. The coffee was exactly right. He made the coffee the way his father taught him, 2 spoons, no sugar, stir 3 times. I hadn't seen him do that in years. I didn't say anything. I just watched, and I was grateful. Rebecca came by just after 7. She knocked twice, not tentatively, not loudly, but with the moderate certainty of a person who knows they are expected, even when they have not been formally invited. James answered. I heard the brief exchange of voices in the hallway, the kind of conversation that carries its own completeness without needing to be long. Then the door closed, and James returned, and a different quality of silence settled over the house. He came into the front room holding a plain envelope, personal correspondence size, the kind used for letters rather than legal documents. His name was written on the front in handwriting I had known for 41 years, careful, deliberate, slightly forward in its lean. He stood holding it with both hands, looking at it the way you look at something you are not yet certain you are ready to open. Rebecca said this was always meant for me, he said. Not for the proceedings, just for me. I told him I knew. He looked at the envelope a moment longer. I'd like to read it by myself first, if that's all right. I told him to take his time. I told him I would be right here. He went to the study at the end of the hall, Charles's workspace for 30 years, the room with the oak desk and the window that looked out onto the back of the property. I had kept it as it was. James had always gravitated toward it when he visited, even as an adult, the way people return to spaces that held them during formative years. I sat in the front room and waited. It was perhaps 20 minutes before I heard his footsteps in the hall. He came in and I could see immediately that whatever the letter contained had reached him in the places where he most needed to be reached. His eyes were clear, the quieter clarity that comes after something has been fully felt rather than held at distance. He sat down across from me, holding the letter open in both hands. Would you like to hear it? He asked. I said yes. He read slowly, the way his father had always read aloud, giving each sentence its proper weight, moving through the words as if they deserved the full time it took to say them. Charles had written the letter approximately 18 months before he passed. He began with an apology, not for anything specific, but for the general inadequacy of letters as a form, for saying in writing what he would have preferred to say in person. He wrote that careful men plan for uncertainty. Then he wrote about James. He wrote that he had watched his son become a person he was proud of, not as a performance of feeling, but in the specific, observed way of a man who had paid attention. He described the way James had handled the first difficult case of his career, the way he had spoken at a family funeral when no one had asked him to and everyone had needed him to, the way he had, without announcement, become someone reliable in the way that reliability matters not when it is easy, but when it requires something. He wrote, "I know you are good. I have always known it. What I want you to know is that I knew it even in the times when you may have forgotten it yourself." Then he wrote about what he had observed in the last years, not with anger, not with accusation, but with the measured honesty of a man who sees clearly and loves what he sees clearly enough to tell the truth about it. He wrote that love sometimes requires difficult provisions, that the provisions he had made were not expressions of doubt but expressions of belief that given the full truth, James would choose correctly, that he had never stopped believing that. He wrote, "The house is your mother's. It has always been hers. She built it with me, year by year, in all the ways that matter more than the legal ones. Protect it the way you would protect anything that belongs to someone you love. Protect her the same way." He ended with a single paragraph. "I have tried, in whatever time I had, to be worth the love given to me in this family. I do not know if I always succeeded, but I want you to know that I tried every day, in the ways available to me, in the ways I knew how. That is what I ask of you. Not perfection, not the absence of mistakes, just the trying honest, sustained, without giving up on the people counting on you to keep trying." And then, at the very bottom, in slightly larger letters, "Protect your mother the way I always tried to protect you both." James's voice held for the full length of that last line. Then he stopped. The room was very quiet. He held the letter a moment longer, not reading, just holding. Then he folded it carefully, along the original creases, pressing each fold with the deliberateness of someone returning something to the condition in which it was given. He looked up at me. The lamp threw its warm light across the space between us, the same front room where we had sat that morning, the same room where he had learned to walk 41 years ago, the same room that had held every version of both of us across every year we had spent together in this house. I looked at my son, and for the first time in a very long time, I saw his father's eyes looking back at me through his. Summer came to Savannah the way it always does, not gradually, not with warning, but all at once, as if the city simply decided one morning that it was done with the hesitation of spring and was ready to commit. The garden came with it. I had been tending it since the week after the hearing, not because it required urgent attention, but because there is a particular kind of thinking that only happens when your hands are occupied with something slow and purposeful. The beds along the back fence, which Charles had planted in the first summer after we moved in, had come back with the vigor of things tended consistently over a long time. The gardenias were full and fragrant. The old crepe myrtle at the far corner had put out more blooms than I could count. I sat on the front porch in the late afternoon and looked out at all of it. There are moments when you become aware, with a quiet certainty that requires no argument, that you have been looked after in ways you did not arrange and could not have managed alone. I was not a woman inclined toward easy explanations for difficult things. But sitting on that porch, with the garden still growing around me and the house behind me still standing and still mine, I felt, with a clarity that comes when you have stopped arguing with it, that I had been held by something larger than the provisions in a legal document, that the love which had arranged those provisions was itself an expression of something that does not originate entirely in human hands. I said a quiet thank you, there on the porch, to whoever and whatever deserved it. That was the first time. James came every Sunday. Not always for long, sometimes only an hour, sometimes 2. But he came of his own accord, without prompting, without the slightly obligatory quality that visits acquire when made out of duty rather than desire. We would sit together and drink something warm, and sometimes we talked about the things that still needed talking about, and sometimes we simply let the Sunday do what Sundays do. He was working through what had happened. I could see it in him, the ongoing process of accounting and adjustment that follows a significant reckoning. It was not quick work, but he was doing it honestly, in the deliberate way I recognized from his father. Some weeks were harder than others. He did not pretend otherwise. We were finding, between us, a new version of what we had always been, not the same as before, but something with the same foundation, rebuilt with better materials and a clearer understanding of what it needed to hold. I was patient with the process. He was worth being patient for. Dorothy came by on a Tuesday afternoon, the way Dorothy always came unannounced, carrying something warm in a ceramic dish, with the energy of a person who has decided you need looking in on, and has acted on that decision, without waiting to be invited. She settled into the chair beside mine and looked at the garden. "Charles would be pleased," she said. I told her I thought he would. We sat without needing to say much else. A mockingbird started up in the neighbor's oak, that full-throated summer song that seems to contain more notes than any reasonable bird should have access to. Dorothy served us both without asking, and we ate together on the porch while the evening came in slow and warm. I thought about the long chain of ordinary moments that had brought me to this specific one. I thought about what it means to be loved well enough that the love outlasts the person who carries it. This, too, is grace. That was the second time. Before I finish, I want to say something to you. If you have stayed with this story, if something in it reached you, then I believe it found you for a reason. The stories that stay with us rarely arrive by accident. I would like to know where you are. That has always mattered to me, to remember that the people on the other side of a story are somewhere real, living their own version of this afternoon. So tell me, where are you watching from? What city? What state? What country? Leave it in the comments. Let me know you are there. And tell me this as well. If you had been in that room, if you had been the one who had to choose between the easier thing and the right thing, what would you have done? Have you ever had a morning like that one? A moment when the person you had been recently and the person you had always actually been came face to face, and one of them had to give way? I think most of us have. The summer evening deepened around me. The gardenias caught the last of the light. Somewhere down the block, a family was eating dinner on their porch, not the words of their conversation, just the rhythm of it, the music of people comfortable enough with one another to talk without trying. James had called that afternoon. He had said very little, but he had called. Dorothy had gone home an hour ago, leaving the evening quieter than it had been. I sat on the porch of this house, the house that still stood, the house that was still mine, and I thought about what endures. Not the documents, not the proceedings. Not the legal architecture that had protected what needed protecting. What endures is the love that thought to build all of that in the first place. I am grateful for it every day. And on the days when gratitude feels insufficient, when the weight of being human is heavier than usual, I find that I am still, somehow, being held. That something has arranged itself, in ways I cannot fully account for, toward my good. I do not take that for granted. That was the third time. Charles didn't just leave me a house. He left me proof that love, when it's real, finds a way to protect what matters most, even long after the one who loved you is gone.